You're listening to Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. We're coming to you from the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations around Vancouver, BC. I'm your host, Bernadine Fox, and this is the show that dares to change how we think about mental health. Welcome to Rethreading Madness.
When I've never been further, knowing what the hell I'm gonna do.
You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox, and today I get to chat with Dr. Colin Ross, who comes to us from Texas. Dr. Colin Ross's biography is so extensive that to actually do it justice, I would be sitting here talking for a long time. So let me give you some key points, and he can fill in what I miss. He is an internationally renowned clinician, researcher, author, and lecturer in the field of dissociation and trauma-related issues. He is the founder and president of the Colin A. Ross Institute for Psychological Trauma in Texas, and the past president of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. He is Canadian. He provides treatment, consultation, educational, and supervision services, and has done so for over 30 years. He has written 36 books and over 260 papers, mostly dealing with trauma and dissociation. And if anyone can talk about dissociative identities, it is Dr. Colin Ross. I have known him professionally for a long time and was fortunate enough to have him write the foreword to my memoir, Coming to Voice, Surviving an Abusive Therapist. So Colin, is it okay if I call you Colin?
Sure.
Oh, okay. So welcome to our show. Did I miss anything in your bio that you would like me to say?
No, that pretty well summarizes it. I, for 30 years, had hospital-based trauma programs, which wound down and closed due to bad business decision-making by the hospital corporation.
Wow.
And I have a partial hospital outpatient group psychotherapy program, one in the Dallas area and one in the Austin area.
That's good. Needed.
Still going.
Very needed. We have on this show talked with another professional about DID and have had Suzanne Venuta, who comes from BC, who is someone who lives with DID. But this is an issue that, in my opinion, continues to be misunderstood. And our listenership are primarily regular folks who may or may not be living with a mental health challenge. So I'm going to ask that we discuss DID from a non-clinical position. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay, and just, I'm going to cut this out, but I need to turn my phone down so that all the other noises aren't happening. I think that's it. I might have one noise that comes up. Okay, I've never done this from my car, so I'm hoping this works for me. So Colin, let's start with the standard kind of first question. What is dissociation?
Well, it's a good question, and surprisingly, there's a lot of confusion about it in the mental health field. And that's because actually the word dissociation's got several different meanings. And people will say the word, but they're intending one meaning. The person who's listening thinks they mean another meaning, and back and forth, and it leads to a lot of confusion. And a lot of professionals, especially ones who are skeptical about dissociation, think that it's very vague and poorly defined. But actually, it's not. It's quite clear. So let me explain meanings 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Okay.
So meaning 1 is just general, if you want to be professional about it, you'd say general systems theory, but it's really just general English. So dissociation means disconnection. So if you're dissociated from your feelings, you're disconnected from your feelings, your memories, ability to move your arm, that's when it's purely psychological. There's nothing neurological going on. So you can be disconnected in various combinations from thoughts, feelings, memories, motor functions, and so on. So it's just a general term. And it's general, like you can get disconnected on a phone call. You can get disconnected from the electricity supply and so on.
Right.
Then The second meaning is it's a technical term in cognitive psychology. And it's been used as a technical term, basically meaning disconnections in memory, going back 40 plus years now. And there's all kinds of experimental evidence for it, which I could go into. Third meaning is what's called a phenomenological meaning, which means it's basically symptoms. So you say, well, what is a panic attack? Well, a panic attack is a sudden surge of anxiety, and here's the list of symptoms. You feel anxious, your heart's going, might be hyperventilating, stomach squeezing upset, might get short of breath, thoughts are racing. So panic attack is a list of symptoms that are in the DSM-5. And it's the same with dissociation. Dissociation is a list of symptoms that we could go into. It's no more mysterious, no more different from any other list of symptoms. So here's a measure of dissociation, here's a measure of anxiety, here's a measure of depression.
Right.
Then the fourth meaning, which is where most of the confusion comes in, is it's a theoretical term about your defense mechanisms. So therapists will talk about dissociative defenses, dissociative process, dissociation causing this, that, and the other. Sort of as if it's a mechanism, but actually you can't measure dissociation in that sense. You can't measure anything in your brain very well. And so we can get into some of the details, but that's where the confusion comes in. What is the theory of dissociation as a defense mechanism? What's the difference between dissociation and repression?
Exactly. That was one of my questions. What is the difference?
Well, that depends who you ask. So if you ask me, I can explain it. If you ask a hostile skeptic, they'll say, oh, it's the same thing. There's no scientific evidence for repression. It's a bunch of Freudian bunk. Well, but if you ask somebody who knows what they're talking about,
right,
really dissociation and repression are not the same thing. So repression, nobody talks about my phone got repressed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So nobody thinks that the general meaning of disconnection is the same as repression. Nobody thinks, if you read the whole DSM-5, the word repression doesn't show up once.
Right.
There's no list of repression symptoms. So again, at the symptom level, repression is a theoretical mechanism. It's not a symptom.
Right.
So at the level of a theoretical mechanism in the brain, with the emphasis on theoretical, not weighed, not measured, not scanned, not proven. Of course, now we get into academic warfare and people have their theories that they hold on to very tight and they hate the opposing theorists, etc. So the word repression comes from Freud. So this quick history of Freud. 1895, he published a book with a psychologist named Breuer called Studies on Hysteria. And he talked about there's a lot of cases described in great detail and a bunch of theory. And they talked about divided consciousness, split consciousness, dissociation, people with blocked out memories, and so on. And he tied it all into childhood sexual abuse that he thought really actually happened.
Right.
But then in 1897, in a letter to his very weird friend, Wilhelm Fleiss, that was the seduction theory. So there wasn't, quote, seduction, which is a cover word for child rape.
Right.
So there was seduction. It really did happen. And you end up with all kinds of dissociation going on. 1897, he says, no, the seduction never actually happened. So that's the repudiation of the seduction theory. So he basically decided it's all false memories.
Right.
So when he was thinking that no memories are like perfect, but basically accurate and basically it did happen, then he was talking about dissociation. When he decided that it's all false memories, that's when he developed repression theory to explain why women who are hysterics come 20, 30 years later to therapy and have these false memories of sexual abuse that never happened. And then he developed Oedipal theory, where it's actually if you were on a parole board at a parole hearing for a sex offender had been in jail for 20 years, and the sex offender said, you know what? Little girls literally want to have their father's penises inserted in their vaginas. And that's just the way it is with little girls. The guy would never get let out of jail, right?
That's right.
But that's exactly what Freud said, that little girls literally, consciously, anatomically want to have intercourse with their dads. But then they get kind of conflicted about that, so they create false memories that it actually did happen with dad or brother or uncle. So that's the theory. So repression theory is developed to explain why women have false memories.
Uh,
Then the false memory, I call them the false memory mafia, they attack DID because it's all based on repression, stupid Freudian theory, and actually it's all false memories. But they're completely mixed up. Repression theory developed to explain why mostly women have false memories of childhood sexual abuse.
Right.
So,
Well, don't you see that the whole FMS sort of movement literally was a replay of Freud's mistake?
yeah,
in my opinion.
They think that they're anti-Freud and they're cleaning up Lodge, and Freud was, but they're saying exactly the same thing as Freud said.
Yeah, so, exactly. And that said, FMS has been widely debunked lately. I think the foundation had to close, didn't it?
Yeah, not because it was intellectually debunked, just because I think it kind of wound down. People aged out, board members died. The momentum just didn't keep going. But the false memory, the remaining false memory people who write in the literature, they say, no, we won. And DID is like dying out. So
yeah, well, on some level they did, because they did silence a lot of victims for a long time. They did not stop other things from happening and continuing on. So, you know, one of the things that we, you know, folks who had dissociative identities were dealing with was organized crime elements like child pornography and prostitution. And certainly, at least here in Canada, there have been great gains made in holding those people accountable and busting open different groups that were participating in it. So some things continued on, but I certainly have seen that survivors have been silenced by it. Would you say that dissociation is a normal part of the brain function?
It can be. Just like anxiety is, just like anger is, just like sadness is. What makes something, so there's no sharp cutoff between what's regular sadness and what's clinical depression.
Right.
And there's a gray zone in between. So if there's a bunch of different ways of measuring depression with questionnaires. One is the Beck Depression Inventory. So if you score 3 or 4 on that, you're just not depressed. If you score 42, you're solidly clinically depressed. It's obvious to everybody who talks to you, obvious to yourself, obvious to your loved ones. But if you're in around like 12, 13, it's a little more depressed than the average person, but are we going to call that a mental disorder? So there's a gray zone in the middle. But at both ends, it's crystal clear. Just like alcohol. If somebody doesn't drink at all, nobody thinks they're an alcoholic. If somebody's had a quart of vodka every day for 15 years, everybody agrees that person's an alcoholic.
Right.
But in the middle, you know, 2 glasses of wine most nights of the week, not really. What if it's 4 glasses 3 times a week? You're getting into the gray zone. So it's the same thing with dissociation.
So if we look at dissociative identities, dissociative amnesia, depersonalization, and derealization, which are all sort of in the dissociative field of things, do all these forms of dissociation develop due to trauma? Because I've been hearing that people can have dissociative identities, but there was no trauma that caused it.
Well, general rule of thumb in the mental health field, as in life in general, is rarely is something true 100% of the time in every on the planet, right? So it's what's generally true most of the time. So now we're talking clinical diagnosed DID, which is what the literature is based on. 95-ish or it depends which literature you're going to, but no less than 90% of people with DID have, according to what they tell you, and the first diagnostic assessment, childhood physical abuse or childhood sexual abuse or both. And that's so it's a huge majority, but not everybody. You know, there's 3 or 4%-ish who don't describe either physical or sexual abuse at all. So now those people, what's going on with them? Could be they were not, let's just focus on sexual abuse. Could be they were not sexually abused. That's why they don't tell you. Could be they were sexually abused. They don't want to talk about it, so they just say no. It could be that they were sexually abused and they've got it 100% blocked out.
Right.
So that.
What about medical trauma?
Well, before we get to medical trauma, I just want to make the point that the idea that you have no memory whatsoever for extensive childhood sexual abuse until you come into therapy, and then all of a sudden a bunch of leading questions and, oh yeah, my dad and my uncle and my brother.
Right.
That profile could apply at most to maybe 1, 2, 3% of people with DID. Huge majority remember a bunch of the abuse, but have a bunch of it blocked out.
Right.
And then also physical and sexual abuse are just part of this whole cauldron of trauma, which can include spending a couple months in neonatal intensive care unit, disconnected from your parents, no touching, cuddling, hugging, and, surgeries going on for years after that. It can include really severe verbal, emotional abuse, domestic violence in the family, even though dad doesn't hit you, extreme physical and emotional neglect, loss of primary caretakers from death, divorce, imprisonment. This is just inside North America. If we walk around the world, then we have to say, what do you think is causing dissociative disorders in children in the Ukraine currently?
Oh yeah, no kidding.
Or places where there's huge poverty, starvation, malnutrition, displacement, people in refugee camps. And then unfortunately in those refugee camps, like in Africa, there's a lot of sexual assault and full-on adult trauma as well.
We just need to stop here for a little bit and take a little break, folks, but we'll be right back.
How can you protect your keys? Simply attach a WarAmps key tag to your keyring. If you lose your keys, the WarAmps can return them to you by courier for free. WarAmps key tags, they're free and they work. Order yours at waramps.ca.
You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox, talking to Dr. Colin Ross about dissociative identities. Colin, when you are working with somebody who has dissociative identities and you are about to tell them what you think is true for them, how do you describe it?
Well, let's just pretend I'm talking to the person.
Sure.
So let me explain to you what I call the inner child spectrum. So the inner child spectrum on the left-hand end, and by the way, have you ever done any inner child work, or have you heard of the inner child? Okay, so let me explain it. At the left-hand end of the spectrum, inner child is just a metaphor or a figure of speech. It's just therapy talk. It means unresolved feelings from childhood. So everybody has, quotes, an inner child in that sense. At the far right-hand end of the spectrum is somebody with full dissociative identity disorder, DID, where the inner child comes out, talks to the therapist, different voice, different tone, may not even know that 2023 is the present year, may be literally cognitively back in the past, thinking it's 1994 or 87 or whatever year. And then the inner child goes back inside and the adult doesn't remember the conversation. So that's actual behavior. That's not just a metaphor. But then there's all degrees in between. So one person, excuse me, one person says, no, I don't have an inner child. Next person says, yeah, kind of, not really, but sort of. I can kind of, sometimes I feel like I'm a little younger again and scared. Next person is, oh yeah, I have an inner child. I can feel her there. I know she's there. And then the next person is, not only do I know she's there and I feel her, I visualize her internally. She's 7, she's huddling in the corner, she's scared.
Mm-hmm.
The next person is, oh, and then my inner child talks to me and I talk back sometimes. And then the next step out is, well, the inner child sort of comes close to the surface, doesn't take over, but I feel like the child and I are kind of blended together. And it's like I'm back in the past having a flashback and reliving it.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the inner child comes even further towards the front. And it's like I'm a little bit in the back seat, just kind of watching. I don't feel like I'm in control. And my body is acting and talking like a little girl, but I'm there watching. And then sometimes I'm kind of half gone. And then sometimes I'm fully gone.
Right.
That's the inner child spectrum equals the dissociative.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, where do you think you fit on that spectrum? So then the person will say here or here or here. And then I'll say, okay, well, so you're not totally sure where you fit on that spectrum, but you clearly have a bunch of dissociative symptoms going on. You've described chunks of time, no drugs or alcohol, chunks of time in ongoing over the last 10 years, minutes, hours, sometimes even days are just gone and missing. Which is an experience that most people don't have. You've described sometimes coming out of a blank spell in a different location. You don't know how you got there. People coming up to you, talking to you, telling you about stuff that you guys have done together recently, like not 35 years ago, like having lunch last week and you have no memory of it at all. And sometimes people coming up to you and they know you, but you don't know who they are. And they may call you by a different name sometimes. Finding samples of handwriting in a journal or in Notepad, that clearly were done by you, but you don't remember doing them. And some of the writing is in a different script from what you normally write in. And the content is the person or the whoever person, part of you, aspect of you, whatever we want to call that, is talking to you as if you're a separate person. You're no good, you're this, you're that. And then lots of flashbacks. And you've described hearing voices. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between a voice and a thought. So I always say that a voice is pretty good volume, like the volume knob is turned up a fair way, so it's pretty out loud. And it doesn't feel like it's you talking. You don't control when the voice says something, when it does talk, when it doesn't talk. And sometimes the voices talk to each other and you're just listening. So you've described all those things. But also sometimes if you turn the volume down, it starts to be, and it's more like a thought because it's not very loud, but it's like somebody else's thoughts inside my mind. It doesn't feel like they're coming from me. I can't turn them on. I can't turn them off. I wouldn't be thinking that stuff. And then that can start shading down to, well, no, it's not exactly me, but I know it's me, but it kind of doesn't feel like me, all the way to, well, it's just me thinking inside my mind. So a voice is, quotes, ego alien. It doesn't feel like it's coming from you, and it's out loud. And you can turn down the dial on the volume, or you can turn down the dial on how much it feels like it's not coming from you. And you've described stuff like that going on. So that tells me that you're kind of at least 3/4 the way out that spectrum. Do you have a full official DID? I couldn't say 100% for sure right now, but in a way it doesn't matter, because there's another diagnosis called OSDD, which is a very ridiculous term, other specified dissociative disorder.
Right.
It just basically means, I say it means DID 3/4 as much. So as long as you're fairly out the spectrum there, it's really all the same treatment anyway. So the treatment for DID and OSPD is basically the same. And most of the therapy for DID is the same as complex PTSD or any person with severe childhood trauma who doesn't have fully distinct separate parts. So in a way, it's like, let's not worry about it too much right now. Let's just get to work.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you. I want to go to the point of hearing voices. I do this work on the radio. I've been a mental health advocate up here in Vancouver for 30 plus years. I've worked with all kinds of people. I've worked with people who are schizophrenic. I've worked with people who have had psychosis as a mental health advocate or a support worker. And lately, I've been hearing more and more about people with dissociative identities who also have schizophrenia. And I will admit that when I first heard it, and actually I probably need to be more convinced than I am right now, that I just thought, okay, these are professionals who are scared of the scary parts, who are telling people to do bad things. And what I used to do when I did a lot of work with folks who had dissociative identities as a support worker was just basically facilitate some conflict resolution if that's what needed to happen. And that usually was enough. But now I'm hearing about people who have dissociation, dissociative identities, and schizophrenia, and they are being put on antipsychotics for the schizophrenia. So in my mind, it all becomes a muddle. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how you differentiate. And is this true? Are there people with dissociative identities who are also have the diagnosis of schizophrenia or psychosis? And how, as a clinician or even as a person muddling through it, do you decide, is this a voice that is one of my parts, or is this a voice that is part of a mental health challenge that needs to be corrected with medication?
Excellent question. So the answer is only going to take 3 hours. Right? It is a question. But so if you DID, there's a whole bunch of studies, probably like 8 or 10 of them. No, maybe 10 or 12 now, in general adult psychiatric inpatients, which is not the general population. General adult psychiatric inpatients, it's about 4% previously undiagnosed DID that can be detected in a single research interview. In the general population,
did you say 4%? Sorry, you said 4%.
So if you go on any psych ward, then you interview 100 people, there's likely to be 1, 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5, 6, depending. But you don't have to interview like 1,000 people to be talking to somebody who has DID on a general adult psychiatric inpatient ward. In the general population, it's about 1%, which is a ballpark about as common as bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. So schizophrenia numbers are usually like 0.7%, 0.9%, but rounding off about 1%. And so if you have schizophrenia, your odds of having depression are way higher because it's a depressing life. It's a depressing thing to have. And people with schizophrenia often have lots of trauma. So schizophrenia, it's not schizophrenia as in the category of a brain disease, nothing to do with trauma. And DID is in a totally separate category of trauma response. Those things overlap a lot. And childhood sexual abuse greatly increases the risk for psychosis. So if, just looking at the arithmetic, if DID is 1 person out of 100, and schizophrenia is 1 person out of 100, then by random chance, only 1 person out of 10,000 should have both. So it's not impossible, but it's it's pretty unlikely. Most of the time, if the person actually has DID, the so-called schizophrenia is just a label put on by people who don't know what they're talking about and don't know what they're looking at. So they just go voices, psychosis.
Right.
But voices don't actually automatically mean psychosis at all. There's people with no mental health problems who hear voices, who believe that they're spirit guides or ancestors or whatever, but don't have any mental health problems at all.
Right.
So,
And there certainly are people who do believe they are schizophrenic, are not taking medication, and are living with those mental health challenges and surviving quite well without them. They have found another way of coping. So
one of the myths about schizophrenia is once you got it for life. It's a degenerative brain disease, but that's actually not true. In the schizophrenia literature, ballparkers, a third of people who have a psychotic episode don't have another one. They just carry on in life.
wow, because they are told that you have to be on these medications for the rest of your life.
Yeah, well, that's
at least up here.
That's propaganda, not scientific fact. And
okay, well, thank you for that.
In the psychiatric literature. So
wow.
Then we could get into the politics of big pharma, on and on and on. But
yeah.
What's the difference?
I believe in Norway they have, there's a documentary out, and I may be wrong about the country, but they address schizophrenia in a very different way, i.e. somebody has their first episode, they do not put them on meds. They literally gather family, friends, community, doctors, nurses around that person and support them while they go through that. And once they're through that, that's it. They're healed. It never happens again.
Yeah,
so this is what you're talking about. There's
several studies like that, or just being out in the world. In general, it's not this, it's not like you've got cancer of the pancreas and you're not getting better.
Right.
It's not a life sentence. You're not doomed to having it forever. That's a scientifically mistaken propaganda.
Okay.
This is by the actual psychiatry literature and evidence. But there are people with schizophrenia who have a downward course, they bottom out and they don't get back. And they are severely impaired, homeless, or formerly in mental hospitals for a long time, dying, elevated rate of suicide, and so on. So the label schizophrenia doesn't actually tell you that much in terms of what's the long-term outcome. And it doesn't tell you much in terms of medication, because I have slides for talks I give on this. So Seroquel is one of the pretty commonly used antipsychotic meds. And the big study that got it approved by the FDA in the United States, there was 350, I think it was, huge number of people anyway. The average score on this brief psychiatric rating scale at the beginning of the study was 47, and the average score at the end was 38. For people with well-diagnosed schizophrenia. And what
does that mean?
That means the cutoff to get into the study was 27. So if you score above 27, you're seriously psychotic and you need medication.
Right.
Average person was 10 points above that cutoff at the end of the study.
Oh my gosh.
Even though they've been taking Seroquel for like 6 weeks.
Wow.
And the definition of a responder, you'd think a responder would be somebody who got better.
Right.
The definition of the responder was somebody whose score dropped by 40% or more. The percentage of people who, quotes, responded was 29.2%.
Ouch. Ouch. That's pretty scary.
That doesn't mean they got better. That means their symptoms went down by 40%.
I know. I get it. I think we had an author on, his name is Rob Wypon, who recently wrote a book that was out called Your Consent Was Not Required. And he talked about this as well in terms of how measurements were happening to approve medication. We just need to take a little break, Colin, but we'll be right back, folks.
If you want to listen to us anywhere you travel, you can go into your Google Play Store and then download the Radio Player Canada app, and you can listen to your favorite radio station, Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM.
I saw nightmares again. I was another person, another time, another place, another me. I was in the hospital. Underground beside the morgue, A freak show in the wing I never thought I'd enter, never thought I'd see. Yet I was alive, trapped in my body, in my mind, where the voices haunt my dreams. I was alive. It was back in the days when I couldn't feel right. No matter what they said, I knew it wasn't alright. I guess I must have split then. I never felt like myself, cause when they hit me in the end, I felt like I could never help but be hopeless. Alone in the darkness, I scratched like a madman, talking to myself and the God that I once knew. No, they were just once true, when I knew I could still dream of the powers I prayed to. Like a fool. Years before I met them. The people in my head, cause like they said I was special. Who knew that special could bruise you like a fork on your hand? The sight of barcode scars, they never failed to make me laugh. I was crazy, I still am. The years they come and go, and the people that I once knew and the God that I'd forgotten, they were with me. Still. Back to back with my mind, Elizabeth in my stride, cube never failing to pick up what she left behind. There was a God who I prayed to, the little girl I once knew, and the cast and crew of voices that gave noise that I'd forgotten, and the music, the memories, the chaos and the silence. Like a fever dream, I couldn't tell if what I saw was violence or if it happened. Did it happen? I don't know if I'll ever see that what my past bestowed me was a pocket full of holes and no memory. No memory. And the story's just begun with me, a hidden for years right behind me. The doctor, he calls for more medicine, an easy way out, the medication just hanging right in front of me. And I count down the days that I'll see them in my dreams again. The person who I once was and the trauma that I now hold, it's a part of me. And I'm still me. No, I haven't changed. With my mind, Elizabeth in my stride, cube never failing to pick up what she left behind. There was a God who I prayed to, the little girl I once knew, and the cast and crew of voices that gave noise that I'd forgotten, and the music, the memories, the chaos and the silence. Like a fever dream, I couldn't tell if what I saw was violence or if it happened. Did it happen? I don't know if I'll ever see that what my past bestowed me was a pocket full of holes and no memory. No memory.
You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox, speaking with Dr. Colin Ross about dissociative identities. Colin, you were talking, and I had to cut you off, but I think you wanted to talk a little bit more about the psychotic voice versus the dissociative voice. And this is about voices that people are hearing. Yes?
Correct. And then just quickly, important point too is that no matter what your diagnosis, antipsychotic meds do not work for everybody. Ballparks, a third of people, even if the diagnosis is schizophrenia, a third of people don't really get any benefit at all. A third kind of some reduction in symptoms, but still have quite a lot of symptoms. And a third or less substantially get better. So they're not like magic bullets at all.
No, and you're talking about the general population here in terms of these stats, not just folks who have DID, right?
That was people with schizophrenia.
Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Of course.
Antipsychotic meds, antidepressants, mood stabilizers are used for many, many different mental health problems. They're not in the actual practical way that psychiatrists prescribe. So you can have post-traumatic stress disorder. You're hyper-aroused, you're having flashbacks. You're given an antipsychotic medication, but you're not psychotic. But it can reduce the anxiety level, settle things down. or a mood stabilizer or an antidepressant. Sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't do any good at all, and sometimes there's horrible side effects.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the difference between a dissociative voice and a psychotic voice? Well, some people with schizophrenia don't really hear voices. And some people with schizophrenia, all they hear is like this mumbling, grumbling, they can't make it out.
Mm-hmm.
Some people just hear one voice going, die, die, die. And then sometimes people hear one of their perpetrators saying stuff, but it's just relentlessly the same thing. So that's more like a memory tape playing over and over. But when you get it's very confused in the literature. So the criteria for schizophrenia include voices, or this is up until DSM-4 in 1994, voices talking to each other or voices keeping up a running commentary on the person. But voices talking to each other and keeping up a running commentary on the person, that's more common in DID than it is in schizophrenia.
I was going to say that.
So,
yeah, it's very common.
So this all depends now on your theory. So if you have voices, and it also depends on common sense. If you have voices that are speaking in sentences, having conversations with each other, telling you don't do this and watch out for that, and you're no good, that's like a little TV commentator in there, right? The voice has attitudes, it's got emotions, it thinks you should do this, it thinks this about you. So that's not just a couple of neurons on the fritz. That's like a little person in there, even though there's not really a separate person. So to have these kind of complex voices that speak in sentences, that's got to be a dissociated aspect of yourself, no matter what the diagnosis.
Right.
So even I think complex voices are always dissociative in nature, because it's like your conscience talking to you. It's a dissociated, split off part of yourself. So that's the view, that all complex voices are dissociative in nature, in no matter what the diagnosis.
Right.
But psychotic voices that are just like monotonous, saying a few words, it doesn't lead anywhere to say that's a dissociative voice, because you can't engage the voice in treatment. You can't correct the voice's errors of thinking. It's just like a tape playing in there.
Right. Right. So you can't do conflict resolution with them.
Right. But even in not so much in North America, but in Britain, there's a literature, randomized controlled trials on cognitive therapy for schizophrenia, showing good benefit. And in that literature, it's sort of like they kind of got the idea of DID therapy a little bit, because they talk about reframing the voices, changing the interaction between the person and the voice to try and reduce the conflict, negotiating with the voices. So they're doing DID work without realizing it and without calling it that.
Right. And maybe that's an okay thing. I did want to talk a little bit about how in Canada here, we still have places, and this may be true in the US too, I don't know, but in Canada, I know we still have places, educational systems, where up-and-coming mental health professionals are literally told DID is so rare, they don't have to learn about it, and they literally do not have to read that chapter in their textbooks. So how often does this happen? And are we making any gains as a mental health community in understanding DID, or are we going backwards?
Well, now I have to lie down and have a little crying spell.
No, sorry.
Well, it's the depressing state of affairs, and it's everywhere in the world. It's not just in Canada. That it may be stated in sort of a professional, pleasant tone of voice, as I'm just giving you the facts here, but there's a really intense hostility underneath it in mental health professionals. And there's substantial literature. Like there's a review paper a couple of years back by a woman in Australia, 98 studies of dissociation in college students using standardized measures of dissociation. 98 studies. This is a big literature. And also diagnostic assessments in a bunch of those studies. And this is where we get the number 1% in the general population,
Mm-hmm.
and around about 10% some type of dissociative disorder. It's not rare. And like I was saying in the previous segment, there's replicated international evidence for all kinds of different languages and cultures. Average, about 4% of psychiatric inpatients have undiagnosed DID.
Mm-hmm.
Diagnosed, if you just ask the standard questions that I ran through quickly in the previous segment, it's not any more mysterious than diagnosing bipolar disorder. Sometimes it's very hard to nail the diagnosis down. Sometimes it's not clear. Is this bipolar or schizoaffective? Is that really a manic episode or a hypomanic? Or it's not crystal clear a lot of the time in psychiatry. So sometimes it's not crystal clear with DID either, but often it is. So what's the big deal? And I think and why is there such intense energy behind the hostility? So I think it's, well, my professors told me it's rare. I can't deal with the fact that my professors don't know what they're talking about. I'll be embarrassed. I've been saying it's rare. If it's not rare, if it's this common, if this demonstrated in this literature that I've never read, well, then I'm missing an awful lot of cases. Then I'm not a very good diagnostician. We're not offering therapy to a lot of trauma survivors. And anyway, I don't want to talk about trauma because it's upsetting.
Right.
So there's a whole host of factors like that. And then there's just the influence of big pharma, biological psychiatry. We don't really want to be doing psychotherapy for people who are seriously mentally ill. Just meds.
And do you think that somebody who's seriously traumatized, is mentally ill, or are they, reacting normally to the trauma that they went through? It would be a normal reaction to the trauma.
Well, that's a tricky debate too, because if you want to we don't want to stigmatize people. This is an understandable, normal reaction. They don't have a mental disorder. Then the insurance companies, oh, okay, great, we're not paying for that. So you have to watch the politics of it. It's just, and it's the same thing with the gender identity issues. No insurance company pays for psychotherapy to convert somebody from gay to straight.
Right.
Because gay is not a mental disorder. It was 40 years ago. And it's the same with the gender identity disorder. If you want to say it's not a mental disorder, okay, there's all kinds of reasons why that makes sense. But you have to watch out, because if it's not a disorder, why would insurance companies pay for it any more than, cosmetic surgery? They could just say, cosmetic surgery. So the politics is very complicated and sticky.
Yeah, and it brings up the point that insurance companies are determined, and I know you guys know this down in the States, and I think we don't understand it completely up here, the degree to which insurance companies make medical decisions on behalf of people they have no business making medical decisions for.
I'm the proud owner of 2 passports. So I was born in Canada, grew up in Canada, but I now have both American and Canadian citizenship. I'm currently in Canada, by the way. So I always say, if you're comparing the 2 healthcare systems, you're actually much better off in the United States if you're in the top quarter of the economy, because you can get quick access. You can get an MRI this week, you can get surgery this week. But if you're in the bottom quarter of the population in the U.S., you don't have insurance at all.
Wow.
So in the bottom quarter, you're much better off in Canada.
Right.
Top quarter, not so clear, because there's the way the insurance company equals the government controls costs is with these tremendous waiting lists.
Yeah, exactly.
But then nobody takes responsibility. Nobody actually says we're not paying for this person. But nevertheless, the way the system operates is people can't get the care they need for long periods.
Yeah. DID used to be one of the most researched and investigated of all the categories in the DSM. Is that still true? And a yes or no is good enough, because I really want to go on to treatment as well. But is there scientific evidence that DID exists?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
It's not really a sensible question in a way. I mean,
Well, it is for the general run-of-the-mill person who thinks that it's hogwash. I mean, most categories in the DSM, I think, don't have any scientific evidence. Am I right about that?
well, it depends what you mean by scientific evidence. It says in the DSM, there's no blood test or brain scan or biological test that's clinically useful for any mental disorder. Does that mean?
Okay.
So then anti-psychiatry people say, well, then these are just made up things. They're not real illnesses, which could very well be true. But people have extreme problems with coping, living, self-regulation, self-esteem. Over 100,000 people died from overdoses in the United States last year.
Mm-hmm.
So forget all the debates and the theories and the terminology. That's a lot of psychological, social suffering and chaos.
Yeah.
We need to try and do something about it.
Yeah. No, I agree. One of my listeners wanted to ask you what the current treatment is that is most effective for folks with DID.
Well, I'm an author of a set of treatment outcome studies. So we actually have treatment outcome studies, not randomized with control groups. But basically, it's just a lot of general psychotherapy. Just support, good quality relationship, empathic listening, which is just the foundation of all psychotherapies.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's basically it's got several components to it. You end up with thoughts and beliefs like, I'm bad, I caused the abuse, it's my fault.
Right.
So then there's the cognitive therapy part of it. There's you often have a whole bunch of addictions to try and blot everything out. So then there's substance use addiction kind of therapy. There's learning self-regulation skills, coping strategies. So it's a whole lot of learning and practicing new strategies.
Right.
And then there's basically negotiating between the parts, getting the parts to communicate and talk with each other, form a team, and start working together as a team instead of going opposite directions and
Right.
one part wants to kill the other part and so on.
Which is actually very hard in a dissociative system. I remember I've told people it's very, very hard as somebody who has different parts to kill yourself, because one person may really, really want to do it, and a lot of them really, really, really don't want to do it. So it makes it pretty hard. Right. Somebody is being asked to take ECT or psychotherapy or psychosurgery, for dissociative identities. Does that work?
No, absolutely nobody thinks psychosurgery is good for DID. Psychosurgeries maybe could be helpful for extreme cases of obsessive compulsive disorder, but that's a really experimental fringe thing that it's not relevant to 99% of people.
Right. It is on the rise here, at least on the West Coast. ECT?
ECT, so depends which psychiatrist you talk to. So I did a review paper, 06 or something like that was published. There's been no placebo-controlled trials of ECT since 1985, which is...
There's actually a moratorium on it. The FDA is not allowed to do any more qualitative or whatever research on the effectiveness of ECT forever.
No, that's not true.
That's not true? That's what I read somewhere. So it would be good if that's not true.
Yeah, there's studies of ECT compared to medication, but there's no ECT placebo studies. And so if you take all the ECT placebo studies that exist, which are old and have really lousy methodology, there's no study in the world ever in the history of the human race showing that a difference between ECT and sham ECT, which is where you put to sleep, electrodes are put on your head, the button's pushed, but there's no electricity.
Right.
It's not one study ever showing a difference between real and sham ECT a month later.
Right. And therefore...
Even pro-ECT people say, no, the effects will wear off in a matter of months. and you've got to be on antidepressants or something else. And psychiatry in general way downplays how severe the memory and cognitive complications of ECT are.
Yeah.
People get ECT, it's a miracle. The depression goes away, their thinking is fine. Sort of like medications. Other people get ECT, no benefit, and horrible trouble with their thinking and their concentration that didn't exist while they were depressed before the ECT.
Right. Well, that makes sense given what ECT is. If somebody thinks that they may have dissociative identities, is not seeing a therapist, you might be scared that this is true. Do you have any advice for them?
First of all, it doesn't mean that you're insane or that you're crazy. It's not a hopeless situation, but it's hard to find DID therapy. So I'd go to the International Society for the Study of Dissociation website, which is www.isst-d.org. And there's right on the homepage, there's Find a Therapist. You can click on Find a Therapist, and then you can search by city or province or whatever. And then people will come up. Then it'll show you either their phone numbers, their emails, and you can contact them. That's the most efficient way to try and find a therapist.
Right. Okay. And if they don't have money for therapy,
then you're out of luck.
is there anything they can do on their own?
Yeah, there's self-help books so go on Amazon, look under Dissociation. One of my books is called Be a Teammate with Yourself.
Right.
Which is basically for anybody with somewhat dissociated aspects of self, all the way to full DID. It's practical strategies, exercises, things you can do.
Oh, that's great. That's wonderful.
And that's available on Amazon.
Okay. Thank you, Colin, for spending this hour with me. I appreciate it. And you've given my listeners a lot of information to digest here. So thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And we'll be right back, folks.
We're not owned by the Emperor, so we can say the Emperor has no clothes.
Vancouver Cooperative Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM.
And that's our show. My thanks to Dr. Colin Ross for lending his expertise to our show, and to Sherry Ulrich and Embedded Systems for the gift of their music. More importantly, though, and as always, my thanks goes out to you for joining us today. Stay safe out there. You've just listened to Rethreading Madness, where we dare to change how we think about mental health. We air live on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM, every Tuesday at 5 p.m. or online at coopradio.org. If you have questions or feedback about this program, or want to share your story, or have something to say to us, we want to hear from you. You can reach us by email, rethreadingmadness@coopradio.org. This is Bernadine Fox. We'll be back next week. Until then.
When I've never been further from knowing what the hell I'm gonna do, when I can't seem to find my way under or over or through, just when I'm ready to give up the fight, there you are when we turn out the lights, and it's alright, it's alright, don't you worry, it'll be alright. Why do I always believe it when you tell me everything's gonna be alright? Yeah. Why don't I wonder how you know? Well, surely you don't have all of the facts. You could be just making